Hey guys and girls, welcome to my second ever video. In my first video we took apart a desktop gaming computer into little tiny pieces. Today we're going to put it all back together. But I do have a little surprise for everyone. I went and bought a new motherboard, a new CPU, a new computer case and power supply. So in today's video we're going to be building a brand new gaming computer with some of the old components like the video card and the hard drives, but essentially from scratch. So let's go. Alright, so here's all the stuff that we've got. We've got a new computer case, we've got a brand new 850 watt power supply, an i9 12th generation CPU, we've got a tough gaming motherboard from Asus, the same RTX 3070 Ti video card, we've got the two Kingston hard drives, Thermaltake memory, we still have the CPU and the CPU fan attached here. We're going to basically use that on the new CPU, and I think that pretty much covers it. So let's get going. Okay, so I've just done some basic preparation. Remove the CPU fan from the old case. I've got the SATA cables for the hard drives and the video cards ready to go. We're going to unbox some things. We've got a brand new i9 12th gen CPU. I'm going to crack this thing open, pull it out. The only thing we care about inside that little box, this thing right here. There it is, one CPU. Now we've also got this Asus Tough Gaming motherboard, so we're going to open that up. Now there is a CD. If you do have a portable CD-ROM drive or access to one, definitely good to install this. Otherwise just go to the manufacturer's website and download all the drivers for the motherboard directly from there. You get the updated ones, whereas this CD can be weeks, months, old and outdated. So the latest drivers, definitely advisable to go to their website. And there we have it, one motherboard. So basically we've got the PCI slots here. There's a couple of extra ones. We're going to be using this big one here for the video card. The memory slots, hopefully this one is like my previous motherboard and actually tells you which slots to use first. No, it looks like we're going to look at the manual, so we're going to have to actually look at the manual and determine where to put the RAM into. Otherwise all pretty self-explanatory. Take this sticker off. And yeah, we've got a little protective plastic housing casing over the CPU connection. So, now in my last video I mentioned that I was using a 650 watt power supply. Now I've decided, even though I'm still running the same 3070 Ti graphics card, the CPU is going to need a lot more power. So the 650 watt just wasn't going to be sufficient in this build, so I did have to upgrade to an 850 watt power supply. It's also Corsair again, and this will basically allow not only the graphics card but the CPU to get all the power that they need. The last thing to unbox is the case. Very similar to the case that I had previously, which is, as you can see, they look almost identical, slightly different. But I did want to just upgrade the case and make it a little bit more modern, a little bit more rugged looking, so that's why we got this one. And of course the power supply. Okay, and there it is, very nice looking. It's got a lot more connections on the back than the previous model that I had, so definitely a big upgrade. And depending on which components we're going to be installing, we're going to decide which cables we're going to actually need to use. Now we've got some cable ties to make everything nice and neat. We've got the 24 pin for the CPU, for the motherboard. These are the SATA connection hard drive ones. We've got the PCI Express for the graphics card, and it's all plug and play. Once you look at the connection of what you're trying to give power, it's going to be very easy to know which cable you need to use for which scenario. So let's start building. Alright, so we've got some of the components now cleaned up. I've basically just tidied up this workspace that we're going to be using now. I will zoom in with the camera, and I'm using a much better camera than last video. I apologize for the granularity of that video. The next thing we're going to do is, we've got a brand new case and we can't unscrew that because it's been done very tight. Okay, and we basically got this protective film that we're going to remove. Don't really know what the purpose of this thing is. Why do they put this on there? It doesn't protect it. Okay, so we've got one side of the case off. So now we've opened up the case, we've got full access to that. We can basically start installing all the bits and pieces we need and build us a computer. Now there is another thing worth mentioning with the case. Usually hidden inside somewhere, and it can be well hidden, you will see a bag of stuff that you will need to actually help you build and add all the components in place. So in this case we've got some cable ties, some kind of dongle and a bunch of screws. Pretty straightforward. We'll put that aside for now. Now this can start to look a little bit overwhelming. There's all these cables and they're all going to have to find a home. We're going to have to plug in each one of them. So if I remove all the cable ties, all the cables are nice and free and I've got full access to them. That way I can basically put them into the positions that I need and then we'll cable tie them in place, make it all neat and tidy at the end. But for now it's going to be a bit of a spaghetti mess while we actually build this thing. Most of these are basically, you've got the buttons on top of the case, your power button, headphone jack, microphone, USB on top. And they will connect into the motherboard and make those functional, make the power button work. And most of the other cables are basically to control the fans and red, green, blue LED lights that are surround those fans. So at the moment you can see we've got completely blank, empty box, bunch of cables hanging out from it. Okay, so the next part of this video is we're going to assemble the motherboard, put some of the things on. We've got the CPU here, basically comes in a plastic box. We're going to be very careful and it's very delicate. I mean it's solid metal but we're going to treat it with a lot of respect. There's a lever here that holds this in place. It just slides out, pops out, and then this opens up. Okay, and we just remove this plastic housing which basically is just there to protect the pins on top of the CPU housing. Now again, this CPU will only fit one way. There is a notch, you can probably see that here, there's a little tiny notch cut out on both sides. Actually there's 4, and that just means CPU goes in that way. It won't go in the other way because the notches are off center a little bit. So with the CPU in, push that in. I'm going to use a lot of force to push that down, lock it in place, and there's your CPU. Now we'll probably use a shirt, maybe some kind of rag, but we just want to make sure the surface of the CPU is nice and clean. We don't want fingerprints or anything on top. And this is a nice fabric shirt, so perfect to use for this scenario. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we've got our CPU fan and the housing that it comes with. So the first thing we need to do is basically sit this housing on top. Now it's got these little plastic clips inside. They will actually go through into the motherboard and then they will just sit there a little bit loose. So these plastic, they're not screws, I'm not sure what you call them, but these little plastic things will slide in through there and actually lock this assembly in place onto the motherboard. So let's get that on there. That went in, but it's not actually in. So these little clips have got these wings on the side, and we just need to make sure that they are actually correctly positioned within the housing itself so that it doesn't move around. Perfect. So all 4 of those gone in. Now we're going to basically get the clips, push them through. Now we probably need to elevate the motherboard a bit. There we go. It's got to be a very tight fit. I'm going to go diagonally again. Yep. Okay, so we've got the housing in place. Next part is basically to install the CPU fan. Now, this is an old fan, it's a couple of years old, so I'm just going to reapply some of this thermal paste. Now, if you've bought a brand new CPU fan or you've got some kind of water-based cooling system, it will come with all of this applied already, so be very careful not to touch that because you're going to rub it off very quickly. Okay, so in the next part, what we're going to do is actually install the CPU fan onto the housing itself. Now, it's got these 2 clips on either side. One is basically non-adjustable, the other one allows you to kind of pivot the connection. So we're going to install this side first because it's the one that can't be moved around, and it just basically clicks on, and there it is, and it's on. And then this side basically clicks on, and that's it. And we can basically almost pick up the motherboard by the CPU fan itself. We want to make sure it is on properly and it doesn't wobble or anything like that, so it's solid. Okay, the next part is the RAM. So we do have the manual for the motherboard. Okay, so the manual is showing us that if you've got 1 memory chip, we're going to insert it into DIMM A2. Now if you have 2 memory chips, DIMM A2 and DIMM B2. And if you've got 4, well obviously you're going to install it in all 4 slots. So we have 2 memory chips, so we're going to install it into DIMM A2. We will see that labelled on the motherboard itself. We can go by the colour. It doesn't look like they're labelled on the motherboard. They probably are, but it's too little to see. But in any case, according to this diagram, we're going to be installing them into the 2 lighter coloured DIMM slots. So we just pop those open. Okay, and again, we just want to make sure they're nice and tight and don't move around. Now, one last part of the CPU fan is we're going to look for a connection on here that says CPU fan, and you can actually see it right there. It says CPU fan. Now, it is 4 pins, but there is a plastic kind of housing here that prevents you from plugging it in incorrectly. So we're going to get this 3-pin connector and plug that in where it says CPU fan on the motherboard. And one of the pins will be uncovered, it won't be used, it won't have anything connected to it, but that's exactly how we want. Now, if we want extra functionality and control of the lights, the LED lights, we can plug these in if we can find it on the motherboard, but I'm not going to bother in this particular case. Okay, the next part is we can pretty much install the motherboard into the case itself now. Okay, so we're basically going to put this motherboard aside. I'll bring this empty, otherwise case, and put it here. Be careful around some of these cables, and we will be installing the motherboard. Oh, there's a sticker here we didn't remove. Perfect. So along with the case we got a bag of screws. Just going to open that up. We've got some kind of, I can only imagine this is part of the case, so it must be something to do with, oh here we go, there's actually buttons on this, and yeah, again, RGB. So this is something to do with the LED lighting control, some kind of module that will control the lights. And we've got a bunch of cable ties, some rubber grommets. Let's just throw everything out there. Okay, so we've put the motherboard in, and we just need to basically grab the screws we're going to use. It's usually 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 in this case. So we're going to find 9 of these screws that are exactly the same. Now when I'm screwing these screws in, I don't do them tight. So I basically put all of the screws in a little bit loose. Make sure that every single one of the screws will fit. And then once they're all in, then I'm going to come back and tighten each one of them. Okay, so all the screws are in. We're going to tighten each one of them. No particular order, just get them nice and tight. That's 2. Make sure you don't go crazy. We don't need to tighten them way tight, just nice enough to be snug in place and so that there's no play in the motherboard bouncing around. So that looks good. Next thing is we're going to remove 2 of these brackets. These are basically the PCIe, PCI Express, I don't know, I guess you call them protective brackets. They're just there to make the case look pretty, otherwise serve no purpose, so we're just going to throw those in the bin. But we are going to keep the screws. Okay, so we're ready to put the graphics card in. We've removed 2 of the backing plates. Basically, throw out of balls, we don't need them anymore. Going to very gently align everything, and that's it, it's in. So from removing the backing plates, we've got 2 screws, and we're just going to use the same ones to secure this graphics card down. This case looks like it's a little bit tricky to get to these screws, not the best design, but we're only going to do this once and hopefully never again, so we're not going to have to take this computer apart for many years. Okay, it's starting to look like a computer. So we've got the CPU, we've got the CPU fan on top, we've got the memory sticks, we've got the graphics card. Our next step is going to be to make sure that we've got hard drives and a power supply installed, and then we're going to be looking at all of these other bits and pieces, all these cables here. There's a ton of them. We're going to need to know which one to use for which purpose, and I'm going to show you how to do that. Okay, so next we're going to be installing the power supply and the hard drives. So we're going to flip this thing upside down, and here we will see these little plastic housings that pop out. They just 2 clips and they slide out, and basically they serve as they allow you to basically secure your hard drive in. Now if you do have one of the new hard drives that are very slim and they slide directly onto the motherboard, you're not going to need to worry about this. You just pop that directly onto the motherboard. I'm going to show you that in a moment, but for now we're just going to use 4 little tiny screws to mount these in place and then slide them back in. Okay, that's 1 in place. We're just doing hand tight with the screws. Make sure it's the right way around. And again, these screws, which surprisingly are Phillips flathead. Don't see many of those these days. Everything is Phillips head. Okay, and we've got 2 hard drives. Now this is the 1 terabyte and this is the 256 gig or 240 gig it looks like. So this one has the operating system on it, this one has all the games and other stuff that I keep. So we can actually install those. Now I'm going to put the 1 terabyte drive at the bottom. There is no absolute order in which way you put them in, it's just so that I can remember which one is the operating system one, which these days doesn't matter so much as it did it back in the 90s when you had different master and slave configurations on the drives. We don't have to worry about any of that stuff these days, which makes just life so much easier. Okay, so I think this is the scariest part of this build, all these cables here that need a home, but that's okay, we will get there. Okay, so before we install the power supply into the case itself and make all of these cables do their thing, we're actually going to have a look which cables we need out of this big giant mess, which I'll try and drag over here. At the moment, we're going to need this cable for sure. This is the 24-pin connector that plugs in from the power supply to the motherboard, right there. We're definitely going to need that one. So we're just going to install the cable on the power supply unit itself. And it's very clearly labelled motherboard right there for these two connections. So we are going to put those cables in. Okay, next. Okay, we've got this cable here. So we're going to go through each of the cables. This one here, you can actually see it says CPU. So we're going to be using that definitely on the motherboard. It's going to connect in right there, which is probably not visible at the moment, but at the top of the case, top of the motherboard right there. So we will definitely be using that one. And there is actually an 8-pin there. So I can show you. So right down here, there's an 8-pin and a 4-pin next to it. It's probably going to be too hard to show you. There you go, 8-pin and 4-pin next to each other. So we're going to be using both of those to power the CPU. This i9 processor eats up a lot of power, so it's going to need all the juice that you can give to it. So there's the 8-pin connector. I'm going to plug that on. Now on this power supply, we can see here PCI/CPU, PCI/CPU. Okay, so we're going to plug that cable in there. Now we're going to need that a 4-pin one. So this is the 8-pin. We need another one that says CPU on the cable, but it's a 4-pin connection. So it's not that one. Not that one. I'm going to zoom back out. There we go. CPU. And okay, so we've got an unlabeled connection on this side, but on this side we can actually see CPU. Now this breaks off in half, if you can figure out how to do it. You just pull them apart, and now you've got a 4-pin connector. So we're going to be using just half of this particular cable. So we're going to connect that onto the power supply. Okay, and now we've got 3 cables plugged in, one for the motherboard and 2 for the CPU. Okay, next we have 2 graphics card power supplies that we need. So they're going to be called PCIe, PCI Express, where the graphics card actually slotted into. So looking at all these cables, we're going to try and find one that says PCIe on it. That's a very old kind of cable, we don't need that. This should be it. There you go. So right there you can see it says PCIe, and it comes as either a 6-pin or an 8-pin if you put them together. So we're going to use one of these for one side, and we're not going to use the cable that splits off from that. We're going to use dedicated cables to power the graphics card from the power supply. So we're actually going to have 2 unique cables. So we should see here SATA, PATA, PCI Express, SATA. So we're going to basically get this one here, plug that in, and we're going to find another one. This should also say PCI Express, and it does. And again, if we put those 2 connectors together, we've got the 8-pin that we need to connect to the graphics card. So we're just going to install that. So it's starting to look a little bit less scary now. We have these kinds of connections here. this cable here basically has 3 SATA device power cables. So we're going to be able to install that and make that work for both the hard drives. So we're definitely going to need this cable. So we're going to plug that in here where it says SATA, and it's got a 6-pin connection. So we'll install that all the way over there. And because we've got RGB lights, I did see a connection here somewhere. There it is. So what we're left with is we've got obviously the power cable that goes from your power supply connection on the wall. We've got this kind of cable here, which is CPU. Okay, so we have 2 of those, do we? Okay, this one says CPU and this one says CPU. Perfect. So this one we don't need. This cable is another SATA cable, so we don't need that. Put that aside. Now these are very legacy, old kind of connections that power IDE based hard drives from back in the 90s, 2000s, so we're not going to need that. We're not going to need that, and we're not going to need that. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cables that we're not going to be using. And there is the cable connection that I was talking about before. So this does need one of these SATA connections. Luckily this cable has 3, 2 for the hard drives and a 3rd to power this conduit. And it does have a button, so that'll be interesting to make that work. Alright, so next we're going to install the power supply. So the way we're going to install this bunch of cables with this box into this box is we're going to actually go underneath. So we're going to flip this case upside down. We're going to make sure the fan is facing downward, just like this vent that's here. And we're first going to get all of these cables and put them in. Basically feed them in through the hole into the main area one by one. Now there is only one cable we're not going to be feeding through into the main area, and that's the one that powers the hard drives. So we're going to leave that one out of the way. Okay, so we've got the power supply cables fed through. Power supply box is in the case, the computer case. So we just need to secure that power supply in with 4 screws. Right, now that the power supply is in, we're going to connect all of the cables to all the various parts within the computer, and then we'll actually tackle this big mess of cables next. First, let's see what we can do with these cables. Right, so we've got this large 24-pin connector. It's going to go onto the motherboard. There's only one direction it can click on. It's got a clip on one side, so it makes it easy. And that's it, that's on. Right, these are the PCIe cables. So we're just going to hold these 2 sections together and then plug that into the graphics card. And make sure that both halves of that are plugged in. Then we're going to do the same with this other one. So we've got 2 dedicated cables running to the graphics card. I'm going to hold these pieces together and plug that in. Okay, next we've got the CPU connection. So we've got this 8-pin that's, we can split that in half, but we're going to use the 8 pins together. So that's going to go straight in there. And this one we have split in half, and we're only going to use 4 of the pins to plug into the 4-port connection. And that's it. At this stage we don't need to refer to the manual because it's very straightforward. We know where the cables are going, what their purpose for. Now these cables are wobbling around. We're going to use cable ties later on and make that all look neat and tidy. So for now it's going to look a little bit messy, but that's okay. So that means we've got power going from the power supply to the motherboard through the 24-pin connector. We've got the 2 CPU 8-pin and the 4-pin connectors plugged in, and we've got the 8-pin, 2 8-pin cables plugged into the graphics card. That's pretty much it for now. We do have one other thing on the other side. If we flip this around, this last part here is basically these SATA cables. So we've got the 2 hard drives and we're going to plug those in. One, and that's 2. I don't actually like how that looks, so we're going to, depending on the case, you're going to have different kinds of fitments. I'm going to want this connector here free so that I can plug this into it. So that's kind of going to go off to the side, and I'm going to use the 3rd connector and the 1st connector for the hard drives. Okay, and then we can connect this into the available slot. There it goes. Looking at this big mess of cables here, I can see one cable that is quite unique, one connection. Let's see which one that is. This one right here. So as part of the case, because of the RGB lights, we've got this kind of connector here. It's 4 pins, but one of them is blanked out. Now we also got this control module, and one of the pins is missing. So we just know to plug that in. Okay. And I'm not going to be using this part of it, I don't believe, so we don't need that. So we can tuck that whole assembly down here where it's not getting in the way of any fans or anything that it might rub against. Now what do we got here? We've got a whole bunch of cables here. There's 3 of them, and we've got 3 fans. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3 cables. This must be part of the RGB lights. There's another cable here that's just dangling from the case, and it's again got 3 pins. One of them is blanked out, and as part of the assembly this one's missing one, so by design. So we're going to plug that in. So that will control, there must be additional RGB lights, LED lights that are on there. This I suspect probably needs to plug into the motherboard or somewhere else, but we'll have a look. So at the moment, from all of these cables, we have this cable, this one and this one. And this one, I suspect the remaining cables need to plug in directly to the motherboard. So we've basically got this 4-pin unknown cable, but we know that it's got 3 cables coming from the fans, so that's something to do with that. We've got the power switch, reset switch, hard drive LED lights and power LED lights. They're going to plug into the motherboard. This is basically the USB connection that's on the top of the case next to the power button. And here we've got the HD audio extension, so if you're not using the microphone and the speaker jacks on the back of the case, if you're using the ones on top, then you're going to need to make sure that this cable is plugged in. So we're going to pull these cables through into the main area. We've got these nice little rubber grommets here, which we can probably make use of 1 or 2. Okay, that's 1 through, 2 through, 3 through, and 4. Then we're just going to tidy this little mess up a little bit. Nice and tidy. Okay, so this 20 pin connector, it's basically the USB one. It plugs in directly onto the motherboard. You can actually see it says USB right there on the motherboard. It's a unique kind of looking cable, so we don't need to double check. We can just plug that straight in. Now we're going to be very gentle. Some of these pins like to break. That's on. Now that cable only goes in one way. Right, so the next part is this HD audio cable. Now it's a 10 pin connector, but one of them is blanked out. It's got a plastic preventing it from having a pin. So looking at the motherboard diagram, it's not very obvious where it needs to go. However, we can see here is a very similar looking AAFP connection. It's got 10 pins and one of them is blanked out and it happens to be the exact same one. So we can be very confident that is the right connection, because looking at the motherboard, there's only one such connection on it. And then we've just got this last one for the fans. Now this 4-pin one. Okay, so here we can actually see there is fan and there's a 4-pin connection, and we've got a 4-pin connection here. So we're going to actually remove that from this bottom rubber grommet. We just need to triple check which one we're doing. 1, 2, 3. It's the third one from the left. 1, 2, 3, and it's perfectly. It's got one of these. It's got these 2 ridges here, so we know we're plugging into the right connection. So the last thing is basically these power switches and reset switches. Now they're usually in the bottom right corner of every motherboard. Now they are kind of outlined here. So what we're going to do, instead of looking at the quick installation guide, we're actually going to look at the manual that comes with the motherboard, the user guide, and hopefully we can identify where we need to plug these in. In one of the early pages here in chapter 1, we can actually see we've got this panel here at the bottom right corner, number 16, system panel header, so page 1 to 19, and that's where we're going to hopefully get the information we need. So the cables we have are reset switch, hard drive LED, power switch, power LED. And here all of those are outlined right there. Hard drive LED, positive, negative, power LED, positive, negative, power button, ground, reset switch, power LED, so, and speaker if you've got an external, like a little tiny speaker, which these days we don't really use. So we're going to just follow that and plug these cables in. Okay, so we've got, let's start with the top corner, top left corner. So we've got hard drive LED, positive, negative. Okay. Positive, negative. Now Now be very delicate and gentle when you're doing this. You don't want to break any of these pins because it will render the motherboard useless. And you will need to go purchase another one. Next we've got power switch. Where do you go? Now the power switch goes into 3 and 4. Next we've got these two are they're not attached, they're two separate little connectors. So we've got power LED positive and power LED negative. Power LED positive, power LED negative. So they're going to go into number 1 and 2. And lastly we've got reset switch. And the reset switch is basically, now here it's actually showing 3 pins, but the third one says NC. NC means not connected. So we're only going to be connecting into pins 3 and 4 on the bottom. Okay, so we've got all of the cables plugged in. Everything is in except 2 more cables, these SATA cables that will basically connect the hard drives to the motherboard. So what I might do is plug those in. Now these are unique kinds of connections again. They've got a metal clip on this side. Okay, we're going to use these connections on this side and these cables to plug into the actual hard drives. So we can look at the diagram back here and we should see SATA 3 and 4. It should be SATA 1 and 2. There's SATA 1 and 2 right there. So basically these are, looks like underneath the video card and not really accessible. So we're not going to use those. However, these other cables, connections, are covered by these cables that have been pushed through from the case. So this will be a little bit of trickery, but we're going to need to plug these cables in underneath the graphics card. There is a chance we may need to remove the graphics card. And in fact, I'm going to do just that. Okay, so with the graphics card out, we're going to get our 2 SATA cables and insert them here and here. Right. Now we can reinsert the graphics card. We're going to tidy up some of these cables and have them hopefully go underneath. Okay, graphics card is back in, 2 screws that hold it down. We're not going to tighten them all the way, we're going to install both screws and then tighten it once they're both in. That one's in tight and now this one is too. Right, so we've got these 2 SATA cables, they just need to slide under here. I'm going to flip this case. That one's in, and now this cable comes from the CPU fan. We don't want to connect it, we just want to basically secure it somewhere where it's out of the way. That's it. We're going to get the case, the lid for the back, put that on. 2 screws hold it in. We're going to do a double check. So at the moment we've got the computer fully built. We've got the CPU and the CPU fan on top. The memory, the RAM, has been fitted into slots 2 and 4. We've got the graphics card, the two hard drives that have been fitted down there next to the power supply. Power supply itself, we've got all the cables that we needed, except for this whole bunch of cables, which we found we don't need. And we've got all these cables fed in. We've got the CPU fans, this cables that power the actual processor. There's 2 of those. We've got the motherboard power cable. We've got this USB cable that connects to the top of the case where the USB, the power cable button are. And we have the HD audio, which connects again to the top of the case where you've got the microphone jack and the headphones connection. Then we also have these little tiny, very difficult to connect power switch, reset switch, hard drive LED and power LED connectors, which we used this motherboard diagram to actually figure out where they go exactly. We don't want to be guessing that. The CPU fan's been connected through this 3-pin connector here, and graphics card is in place. It's got its own dedicated power cables. The 3 fans that come as part of the case assembly, they've got their cables coming through and being connected onto the motherboard, where it said basically CHA fan 3, so it's basically a fan connection. We're ready to turn this thing on. So last step is put the case on. Okay, so when I turn this computer on for the first time, this is the screen I ended up. This is basically the BIOS, which allows you to configure all the components before you get to Windows, including system fan, maybe overclocking the CPU, things like that. And basically, as soon as I came in here, I wasn't able to boot into Windows using my hard drive that already had Windows installed. I had to come in here into this section here where it's got this CSN compatibility support mode. Because the hard drives I'm using are SATA hard drives, they've got the SATA connection, they don't directly interface with the motherboard, they don't directly connect onto the motherboard using the new connection. So I basically had to come into this CSN compatibility support module mode and enable that. And as soon as I enabled that, it allows me to boot from UEFI and legacy OPROM devices, which is basically what a SATA hard drive is. So I did a quick 2-minute YouTube video search and found someone advising of how to actually fix this problem with Asus motherboards. So very quick fix, made that setting change, basically hit F10 to save and reset, and the computer was happy and it actually booted into Windows. As soon as Windows booted, which we're doing now again, it was actually fine. So I was able to log on. There was no problems. It wasn't asking for activation. It didn't say that there was a significant change to the hardware. So it was actually in a working state, which is fantastic to see, because back in the 90s and the 2000s, the moment you change anything significantly in this box, Windows will say, no, I'm not happy. You need to license my installation, so you need to validate things and put the product key in all over again. But I was able to install this. Now, we're not actually all there yet, so we're not finished. Okay, so at the moment what's happening is that this Armoury Crate software automatically started up when the computer booted into Windows, and it suggested that there's all these drivers that need to be downloaded and installed. So at the moment we've got Device Manager open, which you can do through Control Panel. So if you click on Windows, Control Panel, go to System, and on the right select Device Manager, it will open up this view and show you all the components within your computer. Now there's quite a few unhappy devices that are categorized as other devices, and they're unknown, so we need to make sure that we've actually got drivers for all of those. So This Armory Crate software is currently downloading and installing Realtek audio driver to make the sound work. It's going to hopefully install everything we need. Otherwise we will simply need to just download all of the drivers manually from the ASUS website for this motherboard. So I'm just going to keep going with that until all the drivers are there, and it's pretty straightforward. Click download, double click the executable, install the driver, and do that again until all of those devices are installed. Okay, so we've made some progress. This Armory Crate software that comes part of the motherboard, for some reason it launched automatically when Windows started and started downloading the drivers. We can actually see here that Device Manager is looking quite happy, not healthy, happy. Probably both happy and healthy. So if I zoom in here and we can see things happening. There is only one item remaining, this RAID controller. So what I'm actually going to be doing is, because I've gone to the website and I can't find anything, I've actually got my USB CD-ROM drive, plugged it in. I've got the CD that came with the motherboard and put that in. And hopefully it's going to install the driver we need to get this last device installed, because otherwise it's not really doing its thing. Okay, so this is the software that comes with the motherboard. It's making a lot of noise, so it's definitely loading. So all I'm doing now is clicking on driver and basically going to tick everything and say install. And no, I don't want Google Chrome. The CD is going to basically run through a process of installing all the drivers it can find. If it finds that there's drivers already that are newer, which I've downloaded from the website, then it's not going to try and install over the top. It'll say newer device driver found and ignore that. At the moment, anything that's missing, which is that RAID controller, which basically controls the hard drive, it hopefully will install that, and it's going to reboot and reboot and reboot until all the drivers are installed. A lot of the time when you install any kind of driver, you need to reboot straight away. So we're going to be rebooting a couple of times, and hopefully we're going to have no unknown devices in Device Manager, meaning our system is ready to go and working as expected. We're going to log on to this machine. If I put in my password right now, there is still some ongoing installations, but I just want to see if that RAID controller has been installed. So we're going to open Device Manager, and no, it hasn't. It is still pending. So RAID controller. But now that I've started the software from the CD-ROM that comes with the motherboard, the process is underway, so we should see more installation happening, and there it is. Okay, so 15 minutes remaining. I'm not going to make you guys sit through that. Alright, so looks like the software has completed installing all of the drivers for all the components, and the computer is doing its final reboot now. So we're actually watching it boot up for the final time, hopefully. There it is. And if we check Device Manager, we can see all the components here are happy. Nothing is unknown or in other devices, so everything has been installed. Okay, so we're starting up our Fortnite game. I just want to see Darth Vader running around the screen and make sure it all works. And there we go. Okay, so in today's video we built a computer from the ground up. We plugged in all the cables, all the components, we put everything together. We built the thing, and I've basically moved it over there. So please like and subscribe, hit that notification button, and I'll see you next time. See you guys.